Hello, welcome to Dead Good Book Reviews. I'm Judith and I'm here with my September wrap-up. September was a really good reading month for me. I read 25 books, which is exactly what I aim to do. They weren't exactly the books that I planned to read, all of them, but I did read that number of books. And if you've watched my September book haul, you'll know I hauled 28 books, but 8 of those I had read. So technically I hauled fewer books than I read. So in theory, that means my TBR will gradually go down. If you can't tell, I'm still a little bit ill. I'm in like kind of dregs of it now. But a runny nose has appeared alongside all my other symptoms, which is real fun, thank you universe. But nevertheless, it is the weekend, there's light outside, I'm going to film and I'm very excited about it. So let's go in chronological order and show you what I read this month. The book I decided to start the month with was my reread of Uprooted by Naomi Novik. This has always been a really great book to reread for me. It doesn't look it, but it should be, you know, battered and bruised and completely useless because I've read it so many times. This is one of my favourite books of all time. It's like a all-new fairy tale. The magic system's really interesting. It's all about using, not words, but like it's... You just have to read it and find out. It's a really, really good magic system. And I love the main character. I love the love interest. I just think it's really, really good, especially if you like fairy tales but don't like fairy tales that are, as I put it in my previous video, a bit wanky. This is really, really good. I recommend this to everyone. And if you know me and you want to borrow my copy, well tough, because it's mine and you can't, ha ha ha. Next I read Seige and Sacrifice by Charlie N. Holberg, which I can never say, Charlie N. Holberg. This is the third book in the Numenor trilogy, I think. This was okay. It's by 47 North, which is Amazon's sci-fi publishing. So they tend to produce things that are like quite easy to read, quick to read, that will persuade people to get Kindle Unlimited. And that's maybe a bit of a cynical way of looking at it, but I think that's probably the case. This whole trilogy's kind of come out in less than a year, I think. I'd have to go back and check. But it's very quick. And it's very easy to read, and the characters are easy to get, you know. I wouldn't say it's groundbreaking. If you read a lot of sci-fi fantasy, it doesn't do anything that nothing else is doing. If you are new to the genre, if you're looking to explore some stuff and you have Kindle Unlimited and you don't want to spend money because you already spent money on Kindle Unlimited, you know what I mean, then I think this is a good thing to download. I would much more recommend her Paper Magician series, just because it's nicer. It's a really sweet little like romance trilogy that gets very dark at points, but is very cute. That would be what I would recommend instead. Next up, on the recommendation of, I think, Nikki from Books and Lemon Squash, I read Nyxia by Scott Rentgen? Unsure. This, it feels like a really long time ago that I read this and it really hasn't stuck with me. It's sort of gang of people in space, teenagers in space, trying to harness some powers. There's probably a conspiracy. I don't know that this did anything for me that I haven't already got from a different YA sci-fi book. It was interesting. I can tell why people like them because it's really easy to read and it's got that like obvious progression. There's like a contest. It reminded me a little bit of Divergent, the first Divergent book, but in space. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. I just wasn't entirely sold on this, but glad I've read it. Glad I can say, you know, tick that off my checklist of like YA books that I've read. And if the others are in the library, I'll consider reading them maybe another time. Next, I read The Girl the Sea Gave Back by Adrienne Young. This is a interesting book. It wasn't for me, I think, or I wasn't in the right place when I read this. I couldn't get into this at all. And I read it cover to cover in like a bus journey, which makes it sound like I rushed it, but I was on a 2-hour bus journey. Yeah, I couldn't connect with the characters. Possibly if I'd reread Sky in the Deep first, which I still keep thinking I should own and don't, and I must have got rid of it. Maybe if I'd reread Sky in the Deep, I would have connected to this more. I just found I didn't care about the character very much, and it just wasn't for me. I'll leave that there. I can't put more coherent thoughts in. I have written a whole review of this that I will link below if I remember. Next, I finished my audiobook reread of Godsgrave. This is my Godsgrave edition with the blue sprayed edges because flexing. Yeah, really love this. I feel like I shouldn't have to go into too much detail about these books. I really like the Nevernight series. Godsgrave is a good book. It's probably my favourite of the whole trilogy. It's probably tied with Nevernight. Darkdawn is my least favourite of the three, but this has gladiatorial games, which is always really, really good fun. I have a review of this that I wrote a couple of years ago that I'll link below. Basically, if I have reviews of these books, I will link them because I think that would be fun. But Godsgrave, very good, very, very good audiobook. Next up, I read Animorphs 4 and 5. I believe Animorphs 4 is now up on this channel. I need to refilm Animorphs 5 because it was too dark when I filmed, but there will be more information about Animorphs 5 in a bit. In the meantime, go and watch my Animorphs videos if you want to know my opinions on those books. Then I read Darkdawn. It was really interesting. I'd pre-ordered this 3 times and still didn't have a copy until like 2 days after the release date, and I had to go and pick it up from Waterstones. But this is also my Godsgrave edition with the star sprayed edges. Really loved this, actually. I know I've said I preferred the other two, but it's a really nice end to the trilogy. It's really in keeping with the tone of the previous 2 books. It almost like dials it up to 11. So if you didn't like Nevernight and Darkdawn, don't read Nevernight and Godsgrave even, don't read this because it does it even more. But yes, really, really enjoyed this. Have a lot of feelings about the ending. Not in terms of like, oh, I have wept many tears. I just think there are ways it could have been done differently. And I think it was something of a when you write yourself into a corner kind of thing. You know, I couldn't write it better, I don't think. So yeah, really enjoyed. Next up was my reread of The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet. This book was way longer than I remembered. It's really small font. But reread this, absolutely loved it. Remembered why I love this series. It's the nicest character-driven sci-fi. If you've not encountered Becky Chambers books, I so recommend that you do. I just think they're exceptional. And I think that nobody else has written like this. And if you're the kind of person who's been put off sci-fi by the science side of it, maybe, these are a really good way to read that, because while they acknowledge that there is science in them and they explain it a little bit, they're still sort of like, but that's not what you care about. You want to hear about these characters being a bit gay in space. Yeah, really love this. Want to reread it all over again. But Closing Comet Orbit is next, and that's my absolute favourite of all of it, and I'm going to cry when I read it, so hopefully I can reread that soon. Then I read Animorphs 6. I don't know when I'm going to film Animorphs 6. I can't tell you, I'm sorry. After that, I finished my audiobook of Children of Ruin, which is the sequel to Children of Time, which I listened to last month, I think. I really like this. I think it's very good. I think if you're going to read it and you loved the first book, leave a longer gap between the two, because it is not anywhere near as good as book 1. The audiobook is still great and the narrator's still wonderful, just the story isn't quite as... What I really loved was the spider culture and that kind of development of technology and awareness, and you don't get that quite as much in this, or perhaps I didn't get that as much from the cephalopods in this book. I still think it's really good, and I still think it's really interesting, and I still think that Children of Time is really worth reading, but I think you could skip this if you finished Children of Time and you thought, like, you know what, I'm done. You can be done. That's fine. Next, I read The House of Sundering Flames by Aliette de Bodard. This is out now from Galanx. This is so good. I will say about Aliette's writing, I think it's quite hard to get into and stay in. Every single one of these books, I've ended it thinking like, oh, I had a really good time and I really enjoyed reading that. And then if you ask me the plot, I'd say, and that's the same with this, you know, I can't tell you, and I need to reread them. Basically, that's what I'm saying, is I really need to reread them, and I really want to reread them because I did really enjoy this. I like the characters, I like the story, I love the setting, and I think she writes really otherworldly while still being set in the world. Fantasy. If you haven't read In the Vanisher's Palace, that's one of my favourites of hers because it's only 180 pages, so you can't get too bogged down and stuff. But yes, if you like the series, I think this is a really good end to the series, and I will be rereading this. So stay tuned over the next, I don't know, year, and you'll see how much I enjoy rereading those. Next, I read The Gilded King by Josie Jeffrey, who is on YouTube. I will link her channel, maybe. I think I can do that. I'm going to talk about all 3 of these, because I read all 3 books in her Sovereign series this month, so let's do them all in one. I liked all 3 of these. I'd read The Gilded King before, but it was ages ago and I couldn't remember. I'd never read The Silver Queen, which is the 2nd book in the series, or The Blood Prince, which is the 3rd book. I really like these. I hadn't quite realised how much I was going to like the other 2. I thought, like, how am I going to... Reading a trilogy over a month is always a bit risky because sometimes you need that gap between, like with Children of Time, sometimes you need that gap to... Absence makes the heart grow fonder, the characters almost. But no, I thought this was really good. I really liked how, especially book 2, I think, really tore down the kind of ideas it had built up in book 1 for the characters. I really love a sequel that says, oh, you all thought this, but actually let's view that through another lens. I thought that was really clever, and it's a really satisfying ending, and I really need to read the Sol Invicti series next. That's possibly going on my Christmas list, I think, to get copies of those, because I'd really like hard copies because they're very pretty, and I want to support Josie. So if you haven't read those, I recommend it. The Gilded King is quite frequently on offer. Josie discounts it quite often, and I think that might also be on Kindle Unlimited, so go nuts. Read yourself some vampires that are well worth reading. Next up, I have The Silver Wind by Nina Allen. This was not for me. I really hated this. This is like described as a novel in short stories, and it kind of is that. I'm trying to remember how many there are. I think there are four or five, maybe 6 stories in this, and they're meant to be very clever and all connecting together, and I didn't think they were. I had a really hard time caring about anyone in this book or understanding what was happening, and maybe some of that's on me being a dingus, but like if you think you're really clever for saying that a clock is a time machine because it literally is a machine that tells time, I don't want to know. So yeah, this one wasn't for me. I've not read The Dollmaker, which is her previous book. I don't know if it's similar, but this has really made me go like, maybe I don't need to. It's one of those books that thinks it's cleverer than it is. Not for me. Might be for you. That's fine. Not for me. Next, I read After the Flood. This is a proof copy of that by Cassandra Montag. I really enjoyed this. I didn't think I would. I thought it was going to be one of those adult dystopian books that's like, what about parenthood? But actually it was that, don't get me wrong, there's a lot of parenthood in it, but it was really exciting, and there was more piracy or stuff happening on boats than I probably should have anticipated because there's a boat on the cover. Thought this was really good. Possibly not one I would reread, but I enjoyed the experience of reading it once. Get this from your library is what I'm saying. This is a get from the library kind of book. But like the main character, the child wasn't too annoying. There were snakes. That's maybe a content warning for some people, but for me that's quite exciting. I like snakes. Next, I read Joe Abercrombie's Little Hatred, which I think I've talked about, certainly on my blog. I like this book a lot. I thought it was really, really good. It was my first ever Joe Abercrombie book I've ever read, and that was possibly to its detriment, but that's my fault. I know friends who've read this who said, I think Justine, I'll link Justine's video in description or on the side if I can, but she talks about how you get so much more out of it if you've already read that series, or the series that's come before, and I think that's definitely true. You will still have a really good time reading this. You won't have as good a time as you would have had if you've read the others, and I will, when I have time, read the rest and come back to you about how that goes. It's really interesting reading a story about a fantasy world going into the Industrial Revolution, because there's kind of that truth of magic's really cool, but if you have a magic system that has a cost, then surely technology is still better. And it's really interesting to read the kind of clash of ideologies in that story. But yes, if you're a Joe Abercrombie fan, I think you'll really love it. If you're new to Joe Abercrombie, go back, read the first series. The Blade itself, I think, is the first book. Maybe I'll put something, and then read this one. But it's worth reading. That's all I'll say. Next, I read The Bone Ships, which I talked about in my September book haul. I love this book. It's so good. RJ Balpin knocks it out of the park. This is a great set on the sea, but it's not pirates, but it's dragon chasing. It's character driven. There is some beautiful character moments. I can't wax lyrical enough about this. This is so fabulous. This is out from Orbit now. Go and get yourself a copy of The Bone Ships if you're a fantasy reader. You will not regret it. Do the thing. Go and read The Bone Ships. Do it. Promise me. And I read Animorph 7. We won't talk about that. Animorph 7 will come in the future, maybe. I don't know. Next, I read Steel Crow Saga by Paul Kruger. I adored this book. I so wasn't expecting to. It's a multiple POV prince with unlikely sidekick and detective and criminal 4 storylines converge kind of a book, but it's so good. It's gay for one part. That was really nice. It's got a trans character who they basically say on the page like, this character is trans, and then just get on with their life. It's so good. I really recommend it. There's also a dog. There's a dog. I talk much more coherently about this in my review. Again, I will link that below. But if you're looking for queer fantasy, then Steel Crow Saga is a really good place to go. Next was my reread of Now I Rise, which is obviously the second book in the Conqueror's Saga by Kirsten White. I think this is my favourite book in that series. I have to reread Bright We Burn because I've not read that since it came out. But this is just a beautiful book of kind of Ladazoff conquering Wallachia and killing people and being amazing. Radu really finds himself in this book, and Radu's one of my favourite characters. And it's just a really, really good book. It's a really good story, and if you say, you know, it's Jennifer Vladley and Pela, people are like, well, that stories exist, but like Kirsten White manages to weave in so many different elements and so much fiction with fact. It's just really, really good if you like stabby YA fantasy. Or it's not even fantasy, alternate history. Really recommend. Love this whole series. Next I read The Quantum Garden by Derek Kunskin. It's very good. The Quantum Magician, which is the first book in the series, is, I think, better. Just because it goes into depth with the side characters much more. This book really focuses on the Homo Quantus, Belisarius, who's the main character. But there is a really cool set of side characters. There's an AI who thinks he's the reincarnation of Saint Matthew, who is called Saint Matthew, who is, I think, probably one of my favourite AIs ever written. And yeah, I was missing that kind of relationship with the side characters. This book is about almost 200 pages shorter than the first book, and you can tell that that's where that's gone missing. There's still some really heart-wrenching moments in the story, and the actual elements which have the Quantum Garden in are beautiful. There's just a lot of stuff that I feel could have been developed on more. Next, I read Angel Mage by Garth Nix, which is out on the 17th of October. My blog tour for this went up yesterday when I'm filming this, so if you want to read that review, you can. Liked this a lot. It was being sold on kind of a really unique magic system and a really interesting setting, and I don't know if it fulfills that brief. It's a really, to quote Asher from Cat Book Cup of Tea, it's a really fun romp, but it's not groundbreaking. It feels like YA, actually, really. It doesn't feel, which isn't a bad thing. I shouldn't say that like it's a thing to its detriment. It's just not different enough from Sabriel and things to make it, you know, oh, a new step in Garth Nix's writing, but it's also similar enough that you're like, well, what's this doing that's new? And like, I liked the magic system for a given value. You know, the hierarchy of angels is interesting. All the stuff with icons is interesting. It's just not stellar and unique. You know, I feel like you could slot in a different word for angels and you could probably find a parallel, but maybe that's just me. So I think if you're a Garth Nix fan, you'll enjoy it. And if you're not a Garth Nix fan, you will also enjoy it. If you are a hardcore fantasy reader, you will probably think, haven't I read this before? It doesn't do anything new enough. After that was my reread of Gemina by Amy Kaufman and Jay Kristoff. This is the second book in the Illumini Chronicles? Illumini Files? I think this is a really good book. I enjoyed it much more the second time around than I did the first time. As I said in my TBR, I really rushed this the first time I read it, and it was really nice to take a bit more time, even though I was in the throes of illness, to get back and read this in a bit more detail. I think it's really, really lovely. And also with the hindsight of book 3, this is really, really worth reading. That's kind of the benefit of rereading a trilogy, I guess, is you know the ending, so you can kind of see all the moments it's been foreshadowed. Last but not least is Wicked Saints by Emily Duncan. I didn't really connect with this. Again, I was ill when I read it, so it's possible that's my fault. This has been quite rightly critiqued by a lot of people for various reasons. I think it's still fun and interesting and like entertaining, but it's not as groundbreaking as some people make it out to seem on the internet. It reads much more like fan fiction in a good way, in like that kind of entertaining, of course they're going to kiss now kind of moment. Would I read more books in this series? Probably. Would I buy them in hardback full price? Probably not. Is that enough for me to say? I should say, I finished this book in October, on October 1st, I believe, but I started it in September and it was part of my September TBR. So it's going in this, it's going in this video, not in the next one, because it's too long to remember to keep this book around. So there's 26 books, 25, 26, depending on where you count Wicked Saints. Some really, really good ones. I think my favourite of the month that wasn't a reread, because rereads are complicated, I think was probably the Bone Ships. And my least favourite was probably the Silver Wind, which is too far down in a pile now to pick up. I have fewer books on my TBR for October, so this will hopefully be a shorter video next month. Maybe, I don't know, maybe I'll go completely mad and read 50,000 things. But in the meantime, if you want to support me on my book reading journey, my book buying journey, my book living journey, you can like this video, you can share it, you can comment, you can subscribe. That really helps me out. You can follow me on all of my socials, and I will see you in the next one.